So welcome everybody. Again, we're going to do a recap of what we've been covering over the last couple of weeks now and in person here at the university. And then we're also going to give you an overview if you're new to this set of topics. We're really talking about the new urban agenda specifically, which is I'll talk about in a little more detail what that is and what's in it. And many of you probably know a little bit about the new urban agenda already. But the big challenge, of course, is how do we implement our goals? How do we implement the new urban agenda and deal with the other urban challenges that we're facing and the architectural challenges that we're facing, the issues that we all face as professionals and as practitioners and as academics. The world is changing rapidly, as you know, and our challenges are emerging rapidly and becoming bigger challenges all the time. So that's what we're going to recap, talking about the sort of a number of topics of the course. And all of them relate to this question of design. And I love what Herbert Simon said way back in the early 1960s. Everyone designs who seeks courses of action aimed at changing existing conditions into preferred ones. So we're all designers in some sense. But what I love about this definition is, if you think about it, it raises so many questions like, how do you seek courses of action? How do you even know what the existing conditions are? What happens if your understanding of the preferred conditions changes along the way? How do different people work together? What if one person's design is in conflict with another person's design, and so on and so forth? All these questions, but they're the right questions. And that's why I love this definition, because it really frames all of the issues that we really need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the problem of design, broadly speaking. And I mentioned the new urban agenda, which I'll be participating in the World Urban Forum next week. And I was participated in the original conference where the new urban agenda was developed. Our group contributed some of the language, especially around public space. And we think it's a great landmark. 193 countries have approved it, adopted it by acclamation as the urbanization framework for the next 20 years. So that's a pretty amazing milestone in urban history. And as I'll talk about, it's an important milestone in many ways and raises a lot of questions about how we're going to actually achieve those goals. But the agenda focuses upon human development, upon the well-being of people, all people, their opportunity, their health, their well-being, rich, poor, young, old, healthy, and infirm, and so on. Yeah.
Russia also signed this?
What's that?
Russia
Uh-huh.
signed this document also?
Yes, they did. Uh-huh. Russia signed it. Many countries, the United States, the United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, but did not pull out of this. And now, of course, we're back in the Paris Climate Accord. So anyway, yeah, every country that's part of the United Nations signed it, and Russia certainly did as well. And yet, we need new and more sustainable models of urbanism and urbanization. We have a focus upon digital technology already. We need to embrace that and see that it supports and doesn't replace the organic city of physical contacts and of public spaces. There's a lot of language about well-connected networks, polycentric cities, urban spatial frameworks, compactness and density, mixed use, walkability is a big topic, public space especially is a big topic. And that's actually one of the central things, one of the things we certainly wanted to make sure was loomed large in the new urban agenda, because public space turns out to be an essential framework, an essential network really at the urban scale. And as it describes in the new urban agenda, and then that language is mirrored in the Sustainable Development Goals. And that wasn't an accident. Our colleagues at UN Habitat made sure that there was language in both of those documents about the importance of public space, that it's accessible, that it's inclusive, and so on. And I think we all recognize, especially coming out of the pandemic, we hope we're coming out of the pandemic and leaving it largely behind us, that public space matters. We miss public space when we don't have it. And there's a reason for that. All the things that it gives us and all the things that we realize when we don't have it, are already going on. The pandemic has really revealed a lot of the problems as well as exacerbating them of this already sort of over encapsulated lifestyle, this high emissions, high depletion, high impact, car dependent lifestyle that we've all been increasingly leading. And that has really severe impacts, especially on the most vulnerable people in our society, those who can't drive for one reason or another. They're poor, they're unable to drive a car, or they're too young, or they're too old, or they're family members that turn into taxi drivers for other people who can't drive. And I think another lesson, we've talked about this in the course, is that density has kind of gotten a bad reputation through the pandemic. Density is not the problem per se. The problem is the pattern of connectivity. And this is a famous diagram from the UK Urban Task Force. And what you see there is three different examples of exactly the same density, but because the urban form is different, the pattern of connectivity between people is different. So if you have to go into the same elevator or lift, the same lobby, the same entrances and exits, then of course you're going to be forced into greater proximity with all the people in that building. But if you're in a much more dispersed pattern like the row houses, then your connections are also more dispersed, and you're less likely to transmit viruses to one another and so on. Or if you're in the perimeter block on the lower right, maybe it's a bit of a combination of the two or somewhere between the two, and maybe that's a more optimum configuration because you still can have a lot of social interaction in that environment, maybe more than you can with the row house. But again, these are exactly the same density, 75 hectares each, and yet they're very, very different urban forms and very different patterns of connectivity. And I think we need to recognize that we can maintain connectivity and still remain safe in urban space by providing what you might call sociable distancing. You know, you've heard about social distancing. Well, this is sociable distancing, the idea that different kinds of structures in urban space can allow us to be connected to one another and still be safe. This is the American front porch. This happens to be my daughter and grandkids, and I'm waving to them there, demonstrating the point that if I were a passerby, I could still have a social interaction with them and be quite safe, you know, in terms of getting COVID or whatever, and still be connected socially. So I think we need to recognize that that's an essential property of urban systems, something that we need to maintain in all public spaces. Public spaces don't just need to connect us, they also need to protect us. And this is a fundamental point, I think, that we sometimes overlook. And that also means excluding as well as including. You know, if I were just, that was a neighbor and I didn't know them well, and I just walked up onto their porch and then walked right into their living room, that would be really an awkward situation. I shouldn't do that. In fact, they might slam the door and lock it, you know, and that would exclude me from their private realm in the house. And that's what happens in urban spaces and public spaces too, to some extent. You know, we might, if I stretch out a picnic blanket in the park, for example, and I sit down with my daughter and grandkids, and here we all are, and somebody else comes along and they walk right through the middle of that blanket and stand there, and you know, we're going to react in a very negative way and say, wait a minute, what are you doing? Even though that's public space, we've essentially created an area that's almost like a cell with a boundary, a cell wall, and we've essentially said this is a domain that we've now colonized that's separate from the rest of the public space. So this goes on all the time in public spaces, and it's a very, very important thing that happens at a variety of scales, from the, you know, the picnic blanket to the building to the urban, large urban system. And this is really part of a larger way of thinking about cities, as my friend Mike Batty and his colleague Peter Ferguson put it, thinking of cities as contact systems, as a system of interactions and flows that define the creativity and the innovation that can happen in a city. That's why we build cities at all. You know, that's why we want to be in urban environments in spite of the problems that they sometimes create for us. And we need to create efficiencies too, and reductions of resource consumption rates. And it turns out that cities are really good at doing that. more so than suburban and even rural environments, bringing one another together into closer proximity is a way of reducing these emissions and so on. I'll talk a little more about that in detail. And I think this goes back to what Jane Jacobs famously referred to as the kind of problem a city is. It's essentially a web network. It's not an independent collection of fragmented entities. It is a system that's interconnected, and there are particular structures that we have to be aware of, and right down to the structure of public space, which in a way is the kind of unifying structure for the whole system. All of the semi-public and semi-private and private spaces, the buildings and so on, that all have to be ultimately connected through that public realm. And yes, we can have data networks and we can have other ways of connecting with one another, but we need that physical system. We don't have to live in a city to be connected through data networks, right? But we do have to live in a city if we're going to have public space. That's what a city is ultimately. And so the New Urban Agenda talks about how important public space is and describes some of the benefits for social interaction and inclusion, health and well-being, economic exchange, cultural expression, resilience, physical and mental health, and so on. All the different benefits that are listed there and that are documented in the research, as I'll talk about a little later in the talk. And you know, the ecological ways of life that we need. It seems that cities at their best actually allow us to do that, to conserve the landscape by living in a more resource efficient and compact way. And then there's this idea you may have come across already that we have different kinds of connections to other people in space. We have the strong ties of our family and our workers at the workplace and so on, the people that we know. And then there are the weak ties that are people we don't know well or maybe don't know at all. And those turn out to be really important when it comes to forming new knowledge and new experiences, new opportunities. We make those weak tie connections in the so-called third places, like the local pub or cafe or restaurant or outdoors in the park or on the street. You and your friend run into somebody that you know and they don't know, and you say, hey, I gotta introduce you to my friend. He works over here. They have a job opening. And suddenly we've created an opportunity through that weak tie that they have had. And there's a lot of research emerging right now about that. This is a study by Maria Roach, published in MIT Press, that is documenting how having propinquity and serendipity, closeness and accidental encounters can be really important for economic development, for example, and for resilience. There's a lot of work that's been done by the sociologist Eric Kleinenberg. He looked originally at the 1995 Chicago heat wave and the number of deaths that happened there and why they happened in some places and not others. And it turned out that the connectivity of the public spaces and the way that the private spaces were connected or not connected to the public space was a major, major factor in the deaths. In fact, what he called the degradation and fortification of urban public space was one of the 4 key conditions that resulted in either death on the one hand or survival if they didn't have that degradation for other populations. And there's been a lot more work on this. Kleinenberg and many other people have looked at what Kleinenberg refers to as social infrastructure in the city and how important that is. A fascinating and I think important area of research. And so that's one of the areas. There are many others that have been documented. My colleague Doug Kalbaugh has talked about heat island effects and how they can be reduced with good quality public space, increasing shade and comfort, reducing pavement area per person, reducing emissions per person, water infiltration zones, low carbon, low resource consumption lifestyles that we talked about before, and so on. So there's a lot of research on this, but the problem that we have is a lot of it is very fragmented and it's in different disciplines, different silos. And so a project that we developed at our center at KTH in Stockholm was to take that research and bring it together into a curated database and draw from journals in economics and sociology, environmental psychology, urban design, and so on, and bring it all into one repository and provide analyses of that, provide a compendium of that. This is the website interface, and it's just terrapublica.org. You can just type that into your browser and explore it yourself if you want to. And it goes through and categorizes the key concepts, the main findings, the connections to other areas of research. This is what one of the records looks like with the different record fields for each one of the papers. It actually has the papers, although if they're behind a paywall, you'll have to have the credentials, unfortunately, one of the problems of our journal system today. But many of them are open source, or they are, the author will upload a pre-publication version or something like that. These are snapshots that give you different examples of what's out there. Here's an example of sort of looking at a particular paper and what it means, what the implications are for that record, what that study concluded, what the abstract is, the keywords, et cetera, and drawing the conclusion, the main findings, and then the methodology, and how that relates to the other fields of research. This gives you a sense of where the papers are drawn from. They're at this point, all English-speaking journals, but we hope to be able to expand that and include others. As you can see, they're from all continents and all parts of the world. Certainly, there is more of a concentration in the U.S. and Europe, but we're working to expand that and to make sure that other countries are represented as well. So the early conclusions from this project, and we're actually in the process of launching it as a repository that will be available to UN Habitat and other partners, is that there is a large body of literature, but it's incomplete, and there are many gaps, many lacunae in the research. It is scattered across many disciplines, and the picture is fragmented. Nonetheless, we can see clear impacts from the variations of public space structure, and we can draw lessons for practice and for policy about the larger patterns of urban form and regional structure, and how you need to structure urban public space in order to achieve those benefits. And there are particular impacts in the relation between public space and the adjacencies of private spaces, as I talked about. It's not just public space as one thing, it's a kind of tissue of relationships between the public and the private that's so critical. And these structures have impacts on urbanization pathways for resilience and adaptation, and a lot of other impacts. And it's a very dynamic field with a lot of exciting new developments going on. So I would encourage you to explore that if you're interested in it. I think it's a really interesting and important topic. And then there's some other aspects of the New Urban Agenda that I and my colleagues have explored. This is a paper with Peter Nijkamp and Karima Kortit, a special issue journal that I contributed this paper on the role of public space in promoting health and happiness, or you might say well-being, in the New Urban Agenda, and teasing out some of the indicators or the proto-indicators in the New Urban Agenda that might help us to measure that and to improve that over time. And yet, this is where we are today. Public space is currently in alarming decline around the world. There's privatization, there's gated communities, car-dominated areas where there isn't much public space that's accessible unless you're in a car, and even then it's just sort of the inside of a shopping mall or something. There are informal settlements that are very low quality public space, dangerous, unsanitary, and so on. And again, inward turning shopping malls and all the rest of it. So if we're going to achieve implementation, we're going to have to change the sort of operating system for growth, all the laws and regulations, the codes and standards and models, incentives and disincentives, all the other sort of generative rules, if you will, that produce the world that we see today, for better or worse. A lot of the stuff that we all hate, and yet it's not random. It's actually being produced as a result of rules and laws and incentives and so on. And in many cases, it's unsatisfactory and unsustainable. And yet there's some hope in working with public space because it is a remarkably cross-cutting topic, one that helps us to address many other interconnected topics of urban structure and urban life. It's a kind of platform to deal with a lot of other things going on. And I want to turn to this topic briefly. And when we're thinking about the operating system for growth, most people, when you talk about urban growth, they think of something horrible, and understandably so, because often it is horrible. Often it's a degradation of the livability of their neighborhood and so on. So these are the NIMBYs that often get a lot of attacks, and yet we can have some sympathy for them often because what's happening in their world is a degradation. It is a decline in the quality of life and even the ecology and the health at many levels, many metrics of what's going on in the urban environment that are going to go down as a result of growth. But this is another kind of growth, of the biological forms of growth that we recognize as being more sustainable, more beautiful, more healthy in many ways. And it follows comprehensible rules and a kind of stepwise growth, the genetic processes of the genome that express through the proteome and the morphogenesis of organisms and so on. Those are rules and processes that we can understand. We have learned enormous amounts in the last few years about how genetic algorithms actually work. They use chemical control systems. They go through stepwise transformation. The forms compound almost like origami, and there's differentiation of tissues and so on. It's quite instructive and quite fascinating and important, I think. But this is also stepwise growth according to rules and processes. They're just different rules and processes. They're segregated use zoning, remote design processes by specialists who were not right there understanding what's really going on, the lending rules of banks and so on, the traffic engineering standards and codes and so on, the market dynamics, all those other things, the incentives and disincentives that in effect form a massive multiplayer game that we're all playing when we're doing development, that we have to follow those rules, and the rules limit what we can do, limit what we can achieve, and produce what we see. It's not a random occurrence, as I said. But here's another example of stepwise growth according to rules and processes, the shared design patterns, the rules of practice, the design codes, the codes that are different in many ways than the kinds of codes we have today that are different in important ways, perhaps. And the iterative design methods, the different agents that are distributed through the city and are going to the Doge to get permission and to make little iterations in their little corner of a beautiful place like Venice. And of course, a design build approach that's very iterative and gradually crafting and adapting and changing and enriching and so on. And it's producing a comprehensible result that we can see. And so I think we should hold that model in mind in thinking that there are different forms of growth, and we have the ability to understand these and manage these to a much greater extent than we have been. But now here's some bad news, perhaps, where we are currently, which is in many ways moving in the wrong direction. This is Beijing in 2000, this is Beijing in 2010. What you see is that the urban extent of the city has increased fourfold. The population of the city has not increased fourfold, which means that the density is going down, sprawl is going up, emissions is going up greatly, many other externalities, pollution and air quality is very bad and so on and so forth. And yet this is going on right around the world. In fact, we are on track to produce more urban fabric in the first half of the 21st century, in the first 5 decades, than in all the previous human history, which is a staggering fact to contemplate, where we are sort of in the middle or approaching the middle of this enormous period of expansion. And it's going to matter a lot what continues to happen over this period. The rapid urbanization that is not all bad news, don't get me wrong. It's lifting a lot of people out of poverty. It's giving a lot of people much greater health and well-being, opportunities for women and children and people who have had very, very challenging lives in the rural areas of places like China. And yet much of what's being built is sprawling and resource inefficient. And so we have to face that fact, and we have to be concerned about what's happening in South America and Asia and Africa and Eastern Europe, right around the world. You guys know what's happening in other countries like Romania and so on, even in Poland, right? A very car-dominated model. So this is happening here as well as in many other parts of the world. There's also the explosive growth of informal settlements, especially in the global South. And in the kind of market rate development, as I referred to, that's resource intensive, high emissions, high depletions, and so on, and clearly not a sustainable model going forward. And we have to face the fact, I think, that this is a systemic challenge. We're not going to be able to bolt on technologies because in effect, what we're doing is playing whack-a-mole. You know, you whack one problem down and another problem pops up somewhere else. And this is also part of Jevons paradox, the rebound effect. You know, the creation of suburbs was meant to solve the problems of the cities, but then they created new problems and so on. And the same thing is happening now when you know, with green technologies, which unfortunately are often greenwashing. This is the Ainara Tower that was proposed for Dubai. I have to tell you that the propeller, the wind turbine there, was entirely fake. This is a building that faces into the Arab sun, you know, into the west with an entire glazing curtain wall. And yet it was celebrated as an icon of sustainability. And you know, if they were bolting on technologies that were making it more sustainable, they were only doing that on top of a typology that was already way down underneath where we needed to be in terms of sustainable typologies. And this is the kind of fantasy-driven architecture that I think we all recognize as deeply problematic and has infected our profession at many levels. It's good marketing. It's a good way to sell some razzle-dazzle, exciting new thing. It's all about the future. It's all, you know, if it's newer, it's better automatically and so on. And yet, if we look harder at what the problems are and what the rebound effects are, then we have to really confront this reality that we have many challenges that we're not dealing with, especially when it comes to informal settlements and so on, which, yes, we need to overcome the urgent need to overcome poverty and its ills, but we also need a viable alternative to this model of urbanization. You might call it the crack cocaine of economic development. Yes, it creates wealth. Yes, it creates prosperity and lifts people out of poverty, but at a huge externality cost, the problems of sprawl, the problems of habitat destruction, emissions, pollution, et cetera, and the problem of gentrification in the core. And the sprawl in the periphery is also having human impacts. It's causing isolation. It's causing separation, segregation by class, and so on. And the gentrification is doing that too. So we need to avoid this economic high, if you will, that is followed by perhaps a planetary hangover if we don't figure out how to deal with it. Because in both cases, we're failing to provide really what cities can, which is opportunities for all people to participate in improving their well-being, at the same time improving the ecological performance of the city as a whole, as we've seen that we can do. So I wanted to illustrate this point with this issue of greenhouse gas emissions, and this was an area of my own research that I was involved in. And what you see here is a chart of greenhouse gas emissions per capita in cities versus in countries. Now, this is consumption-based. In other words, what I'm consuming if I'm driving or living in my home or whatever, not just because I'm working in an oil refinery or something like that. So consumption-based, I think, is a good apples-to-apples way to measure it. And what you see is that here's New York City's emissions per capita, about 7,000 metric tons, and 23 metric tons in the United States, about a threefold increase of the greenhouse gas emissions per capita, which means that New York City is much more efficient in terms of the emissions of greenhouse gases. And also, by the way, other externalities, other implications of resource depletion and so on. And then look at what happens with Sweden, about 3 times again, between Sweden overall and the United States overall. And then Stockholm, between Stockholm and the rest of Sweden, you see once again about a doubling. So Stockholm itself is about twice as efficient as the average Swedish settlement, the smaller cities and towns and so on, and the rural settlements. And then look at this, between Stockholm as an urban pattern and the average United States settlement pattern is about a 6 times increase, which is a staggering number. And if you think about what is causing that, well, it's not because the United States is 6 times wealthier. It's not. In fact, Swedes are wealthier on average. It's not 6 times happier by any measure. It's only 6 times more wasteful of resources. And it's 6 times more wasteful primarily because the urban pattern is different. That's the major variable, as my research has shown. And you can see how just density is a major component of that. If you bring everything closer together, you have shorter travel distances, shorter infrastructure, less waste of leakage from pipes and transmission and so on. And so, yeah, we see that fact that density is strongly correlated. And if you see, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, the low emissions area in the dark green on the left, and the high density areas in the dark red on the right, there's a direct one-to-one correspondence there that's quite striking. Similarly, there's an inverse correspondence between the high emissions area on the lower left image at the right of the lower left image, and then at the lower right image, this is in the East Bay area. Quite a striking inverse relationship between emissions and density. And this is, by the way, this is emissions from transportation, but I could show you similar charts for other forms of emissions, other forms of consumption and depletion. But it's not just the density, it's other factors of urban form that affect impacts, the mix of destinations and uses, the connectivity, whether you have multimodal transportation or everybody has to drive, whether you have compact housing and so on. So here, for example, is that area of low density, low emissions rather, and high density this is in Russian Hill in San Francisco. And I actually used to live there. I can tell you it's a wonderful place to live. That's my apartment actually above the streetcar there, cable car. And it's a wonderful place. Had a little shop where I could stop off and get groceries. I had transit, I could walk everywhere, very desirable. And indeed, it's a very expensive area now. This is the East Bay area where you see, again, a very fragmented pattern. Everybody drives everywhere. You've got big houses because people tend to sort of pull up in their houses and fill them with all kinds of consumption devices of various kinds because there's not much of a public realm. What else are you going to do but sort of hole up in your house or get in your car and drive somewhere? And so these are the impacts that are so different. This is the walkable mixed use, the mix of destinations, the more compact settlement types and settlement patterns, the interconnected grid of streets, a very different urban form than this, which is a fragmented set of more like dendritic patterns of streets. You have to pretty much drive everywhere. Transit is not viable. You tend to have larger homes that are places that people can retreat into because there's not much of a public realm and so on. And this is not only an ecological and environmental issue, it's an economic issue too, because if you look at where the global financial crisis of 2008 actually began, lo and behold, it began in the drive till you qualified suburb. This is the inner core of Houston, where the circles represent the number of foreclosures. And you see that the number of foreclosures was quite low in the center of Houston and quite high in those outer drive till you qualified suburbs. There's more sprawling, like the East Bay in San Francisco. I can show you image after image, chart after chart that shows that same pattern. This is where the mortgage meltdown happened and where the global financial crisis happened in 2008. So I hope that was a shot across the bow that this is not just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue that we're not going to be able to sustain this way of doing things economically or in any other sense of the word. So when you total it up, as my research did, and these are conservative numbers, but when you look at the magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions that's attributable to urban form, the result of urban form as it relates to transportation, infrastructure, building types, ecosystem services, and so on, you end up with about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions attributable to urban form. Again, I think that's a conservative number, but I demonstrated that in my research in a number of peer-reviewed research articles. And then if you think about the other opportunities that you get from proximity, cogeneration, renewable energy technologies, and so on, that number can be significantly lower. And then there's the issue of behavioral factors and the fact that human beings tend to behave differently in different kinds of environments. There's this phenomenon from behavioral economics known as choice architecture, that if you're within a system where you're having to drive everywhere, this is in San Antonio, Loop 410 on the north side of the city, you're not going to walk in that environment. You're not going to ride your bike. You're not going to necessarily eat healthy food because it's not particularly available. You're probably going to, if you're hungry, you're going to drive through because there's lots of drive-through restaurants. And you're going to have a lot of packaging and a lot of high consumption, eating a lot of meat and so on. I'm not against meat, but I'm against overdoing it with the consumption of meat because it's a great contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas if you're in, say, the Amsterdam environment, you've got a lot more choices, a lot of other choices to walk, to bike, to stop off at a little grocery store and get some healthy food on the way home and have an active public realm, maybe a pretty small dwelling, but a great outdoor area to hang out in. And these are the mental models that we have chosen. This is not a random accident that we built the world as we did on the left. There were people who planned this. You might say it was a government plot in this sense, because certainly governments played a big role in doing things like building the freeways and creating the zoning and doing all the other things to implement this this model on the left, which is essentially the model of the CM, the 1933 Charter of Athens. The idea that you're going to pull everything apart in the city, you're going to rationally segregate it and put it into this antiseptic kind of configuration. You don't want the messiness of the right, that sort of, oh, everybody's on top of everybody else and it's chaotic and it's crazy and it's unsanitary and we don't like that. Rome is much too huddled, as Le Corbusier said, and we mustn't have sidewalk cafes because they're the fungus that eats the streets of Paris, as Le Corbusier said. And so as our colleagues and friends, Saskia Sassen, Richard Sinnott, Ricky Burdett, and Juan Clos, Clos was the Secretary General of Habitat 3. Ricky Burdett is the director of the urbanism program at London School of Economics. And Saskia Sassen and Richard Sinnott are well-known sociologists who published extensively on many issues related to this. And they wrote something called the Quito Papers, where they said, look, we've got to have a new paradigm. We've got to move away from the old paradigm of the 1933 Charter of Athens. We need a reframing of the discourse and practice of planning, which is what the new urban agenda really is. We need to move away from these rationally segregated urban elements, you know, the capsule of the home and the capsule of the workplace connected by the capsule of the car. And there's no real public space there. There's maybe swoopy landscape areas, but there's not the mixing and the dynamism between the public and the private that has been happening in the older cities. And again, this was consciously planned. This was an advertisement from 1935, long before any of this was actually built. And that's a model by Norman Belgetti's, an American designer who was taking Le Corbusier's model of the towers in the park and the radiant city and saying, wouldn't this be fantastic? And running that in advertisement for Shell Oil and General Motors, the great diorama at the World's Fair and so on, really selling this vision, this intoxicating vision of a rational future, pristine, sanitary, beyond the horrors of the past, the disease and so on, which were real problems to be sure, but maybe the medicine was worse than the disease in some ways. And so this is what we built. This is Dallas in 1990 or so. This is the world that exists now all over our urban landscapes. So what Sinnott said in a paper that he wrote called The Open City was we need to apply ideas about open systems that are currently animating the sciences to animate our understanding of the city and its open public spaces, how public spaces actually function. And this is something that I've been very interested in. I'm just going to touch on one topic, which we talked about in the course, and this is the overarching idea of symmetry. Symmetry, of course, is an ancient mathematical concept, goes back to Pythagoras and many other mathematicians and physicists. Symmetry is now a core topic in the world of physics and our understanding of how structures evolve in the universe through symmetry breaking and reforming. The Big Bang is thought to be a great symmetry breaking event. Some of the structures that have formed as a result of that have taken on very important geometric characteristics that turn out to be essential for life and essential for the formation of planets and the formation of all the structures that we now see in our world today, including biological structures. You remember the example of the milk drop. So my colleague Nikos Salingros and I looked at this issue, and we found some very interesting, intriguing research as part of a broader topic, but I'll just mention it here. The idea that symmetry in our built environment turns out to have very important contributions to our well-being. And I'm not just talking about the mirror symmetry of left and right, but other forms of symmetry, as I'll talk about. And if we don't have those kinds of structures in our built environment, we suffer. There's measurable outcomes from. We're doing all kinds of interesting research nowadays. I mean, many researchers in neuroscience and in many other fields. And I think you guys are looking into that as well, doing actually, MRI studies and eye scanning studies and other things where you can see what kinds of structures people are looking at, and also what their stress levels are, whether they're calmed down or distressed or other things. And there is something that we call symmetry deficit disorder, where people are actually made unwell by certain kinds of environments that lack these kinds of structures. And this is part of a broader set of topics that I'll get to about biophilia and what we're understanding about the way the built environment works. And these are two environments, by the way. Actually, let me show you these two, these two environments are just about a mile or so apart in London. The Seven Dials, which is a famous example of this is a roundabout, and you can see people sitting, actually having their lunch right in the middle of this roundabout. Clearly, they want to be there. They will actually cross the traffic in order to sit there and enjoy that environment. And they don't see anybody here in this environment. One of our contemporary structures built in the 1960s. And I think most people would say it's a rather sad example of what we have allowed to happen in our profession. Again, this idea of biophilia, this is the British Museum, and you can see that not only the vegetation and water and so on, but there are biological forms in the architecture itself. There's the column capital, the human figures and the animal figures and so on. I'm not saying we need to copy that. This is not about a look. This is about understanding the deeper phenomena that are going on in deeper structure that we maybe need to recapitulate in some way, in some deeper sense. So again, it's not just mirror symmetry like the two faces of the tiger or the two sides of the classical column. It's also rotational radial symmetry. It's translational symmetry, the little baby ducks in a row, or motif that repeats in a row, and scaling symmetry, where you have the same form at different scales. And our brains love to see these things. They love to sort of wrap themselves around these forms and understand them. They're comprehensible to us because we're probably hardwired to understand and to respond to these kinds of environments. We all know the sort of beautiful patterns of the kaleidoscope, and those are compound symmetries that combine the mirror symmetries and the rotational symmetries and the scaling symmetries, the translational symmetries, and so on. The famous fractal patterns that computers can generate that are very beautiful and have these sort of symmetrical characteristics to them. The natural landscapes that have those kind of fractal and symmetrical, the tree itself is symmetrical, maybe multiple trees are examples of mirror symmetrical. Multiple trees are translational symmetries. There are scaling symmetries in the different leaves and patterns and so on. And we love to be in those environments. We find them calming and restorative, and we're hardwired to to love those. That's the essential idea of biophilia. And the idea of deep symmetry, that we respond when we look at certain kinds of forms that remind us of ourselves, that reflect ourselves and our own existence. Obviously, another human being, or a sculpture of a human being, or a landscape where we feel ourselves, in relationship to that beautiful landscape, or the way architecture can relate to the landscape, and we can understand those sort of pyramidal structures as they sort of rotate, and the pagoda-like structures on top of them, that we see those symmetries, and we understand it, and we find it beautiful. And of course, the human face, which is, as I was saying earlier, we're really hardwired to be able to read and understand and appreciate at a very deep level. And that's pretty obviously because we need to do that. We need to be able to understand if somebody is an enemy, if they're going to threaten us, or if they're a friend, or if they're a potential mate, or what their mood is, what their attitude is, what their personality is, perhaps. And we can see all those different forms of symmetry: the mirror symmetry, the rotational symmetry, the translational symmetry, the eyelashes, for example, and the fractal symmetries, the different, the sort of big curves and the little curves and the tiny curves and so on. All those different characteristics in the human face. And there's a lot of really interesting neuroscience that's emerged about this. Samir Zeki at University College London has talked about how we clearly seek out this kind of geometric experience. You could call it an aesthetic experience, but it's more than that. It's an immersive experience of being in these places where we feel well. And he says it nourishes the emotional brain, because that's something that the brain needs from a neurobiological point of view. If you put somebody into a sterile prison cell, that's about the worst thing you could do to them, right? And people will become very psychotic even over time. And you can do the same thing to animals. One of the cruelest things we do to animals often is put them in isolation and so on, and in environments where there's nothing, no richness to the surroundings. And so this is something that he says it's an essential ingredient in nourishing the emotional brain. It's not a luxury. And when he uses the word beauty, what he's saying from a neurobiologist point of view is he's saying, when we have a particular kind of experience and our brains light up, and we say, oh, that's beautiful. Well, that is what beauty is. Beauty is a certain kind of reaction we have that is a particular structure in the brain that turns out to respond to a particular structure in the environment. It's not random, it's not arbitrary. It's not just in the eye of the beholder. And a lot of the research is illustrating that point, that you can measure the similar patterns of firing and so on between beauty and ugliness, for example. And that this goes back to Edmund Burke, the philosopher in the 1700s, thinking that there's some quality in bodies acting mechanically, as he put it, upon the human mind by the intervention of the senses. And that does indeed seem to be some version of that is the case. We can see, for example, that people who have a view out of a window when they're recovering from surgery actually recover faster, require fewer drugs, have less post-operative complications and so on. And this study was back in 1984, and since then there's been an explosion of research in this area that's quite fascinating. And it's many, many measurable outcomes that we can see from these kinds of experiences. Hospital design is beginning to change as a result of that, taking people out of these sort of mechanical clinical environments and putting them into places where they have a view of the outdoors and they have a more sort of natural, almost like a hotel room where their family can be and so on, where the stress levels are low. There's a lot of research on that. And where actually we can see an ecological benefit to that, because if we love something, as this person points out, if we want to be in the beautiful outdoors, then we're more likely to walk, we're more likely to bike, we're more likely to do things that are more ecological as a result of that. And that, yes, there is a social construction aspect of this. We shouldn't overlook that. But I think what we need to understand is that there is a biological root to it, and then there's a differentiation that happens as a result of the social construction. So we as professionals, for example, and as specialists might have very unique social constructions that our particular group has, if we're architects or whatever, as opposed to most of the users who are actually using our building. So if we're designing mostly for the users and not just for ourselves, which as professionals, clearly we're not, then maybe we need to rethink how much and to what degree we need to respond to the users' perceptions and experiences and to these common biological roots that are so important. And this is this idea, again, of what Jane Jacobs referred to as the kind of problem a city is. And if you know her work, or if you don't know her work, it's wonderful. I highly encourage you to read, for example, Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she talked about organized complexity and how important that is. And this is really part of a broader trend, as she described, the changing scientific view of modernity, where we're moving from more lineal systems to more interactive systems, systems that are structured into a mutually adaptive, self-organizing, complex adaptive system that's a little bit more like the rock, paper, scissors game. There isn't a neat hierarchy to it. And this is something Christopher Alexander talked about in his great paper, A City is Not a Tree. Even at the lowly sidewalk and with a newspaper rack and a crosswalk signal, there's an interaction that's going on that's more like this rock, paper, scissors thing. They all work as a system. And if you lose that in a city, you're losing something essential. And if you lose that in an ecology, you're losing something really essential as well. A number of people have described this as a new kind of science, that we're moving into a world of understanding complex interactions and algorithms and iterations. We talked in the course about cellular automata and how those are relatively simple rules that interact and create very complex patterns. And you can see examples of that in genetic processes and how that does lead to very complex tissues and organs and so on, that produces the incredible variety and the incredible beauty of the natural world, of the biological world. And also we can see similar processes in human traditions that there have been examples that have looked at that in terms of the fractal structure of traditional African art, for example, and other things. And I think this points us towards a new agenda, indeed, a new urban agenda, a new scientific agenda, going right back to Jacobs, who described a lot of this in Death and Life. The changes in the mental methods that we use for probing the world, the new understanding of network science that has evolved over the last decades. Some of you may know about Bruno Latour's work on actor network theory, where essentially the understanding of the social world is one of actors that are all embedded in a network of relationships. And the actor can be a person, it can be a thing, it can be a region of space, it can be an institution. It can really be anything in the urban environment or in the social world. It can be the dog. You might not walk up to a stranger and say, "Hello, my name is so and so," but the dog might run up to you and lick your hand, and then next thing you know, you have a contact, and you say, "Oh, is this your pet?" And you start to have a conversation. There's a connection that you have as a result of that third actor, that actor network. And the same thing is true with the third places, as we talked about before. And this is this idea of this interactive system, this rock, paper, scissors relationship. So I'm going to try to wrap it up shortly, but I want to talk a little bit about Christopher Alexander's work, who we've talked about a lot in this course. And starting with Herbert Simon, a great polymath who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, although he was thought of more as a systems scientist, a cybernetic scientist, thinking about how complex systems work, how we're going to deal with them in the cybernetic age. And he said in this paper, they are nearly decomposable hierarchies. You can decompose a design problem into almost a hierarchy, but there you have this nearly decomposable aspect to it, these tangles or these things that are not exactly decomposable. And that turns out to be very, very important. That was the insight that Christopher Alexander took forward on Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and then later A City is Not a Tree, as I described, where he called them overlap. You have these interconnecting relationships that form these sort of rock, paper, scissors relationships or semi-lattices, as you referred to them. We would think of them today as web networks, like the internet, of course. And then they form these particular clusters or tangles or more highly connected regions that are somehow connected with other regions through weak ties. They themselves have strong ties, and then they're connected with other regions through what are called weak ties. And this was the genesis of Alexander's idea of patterns. You could identify these regions of strong ties and call them patterns and work with them as patterns. And for example, I'll give you a trivial example of a door. There are strong ties in the relationship between the hinges and the knob, right? There are weak ties or weak links between the entire door and some other door that could sort of slide around in the room, and it wouldn't matter. The door would still function regardless of where the other door is, right? But if you took that door and put the hinges and the knob on the same side, the strong ties are going to get you in trouble, right? Because now you can't even open the door. You know, you'd look at it and you say, wait a minute, that door is not going to function. Or if you put the knobs and the hinges in some crazy position and so on and so forth, that would be even harder to deal with. So there's an essential relationship of those elements. There's strong ties between them. And then at another scale, at that scale, you might say, yeah, well, you need to place the hinges on one side and the handle on the other side and so on. But at the scale of a room, you might say, well, you can let the doors sort of drift around a little bit. But you might also at that scale say, well, wait a minute, if you want to have the entrance here, then you need to have the door out to the next room over here. Suddenly that's becoming a strong tie again. And you have a new pattern at the larger scale that's connected to the pattern at the previous scale and connected down to the pattern of maybe the hinges and the screws on the hinges and so on and so forth. So you can see that all the patterns are embedded in other scales, larger and larger and larger scales until you get to the house and the block and the neighborhood and city and the region and the globe ultimately. And this is, by the way, very close to what Aristotle talked about way back when, and in his theory of hylomorphism, the relationship between substance and matter, as he described it, the emergence of form. And so this is an update, if you will, of Aristotle, bringing in some insights about these interconnected web-like relationships and how important those are, how essential those are really to any kind of environmental structure. And that was the genesis of Alexander's idea of developing a pattern language, a kind of generative system that included many of these patterns, not as trivial as door, but other patterns like that, like how you do the shape of a path or so on. And, you know, many people think of that as, oh, well, that was something that happened back in the 1970s. It's not relevant to our modern architectural practice anymore. It's a creature of its time. Well, wake up and smell the coffee, because pattern languages are ubiquitous in many, many fields around the world today, including software, including the software that's running my computer right now, including many games, many other examples in the software world and in many other domains too. It directly resulted in the evolution of Agile, the evolution of Wiki, as my colleague Ward Cunningham documented, and Wikipedia was a direct outgrowth, Scrum, which is a management strategy, many, many, many other innovations that came directly from these insights. So these ideas have power, and they have really important uses even today. And I think also in the architecture world, but I think we have to recognize, as Alexander did, that there were some key issues, at least in the architectural world. It was trapped, the patterns were trapped in this sort of Bible-like volume, only 253 of them. It was hard to interface with conventional modern systems and methods. And especially there was not enough information about form and about geometry. And that was something that Alexander was very concerned about. And it set him on the course for the next 25 years of developing his magnum opus called The Nature of Order. Many people don't understand that book if they've even looked at it at all. They tend to think of it as mysticism. It's actually a straight line in his pursuit of hylomorphism and of Mariology, the great old word in philosophy, the part-whole relations, an ancient topic to be sure. And so The Nature of Order asks, in essence, how does nature achieve this marvelous order, this great beauty and sustainability and health and all these attributes that we want all around us. Nature does not make little blueprints as we've been doing. It doesn't specify, it generates, it makes something more like codes or recipes for growing forms. And those results are complex, adaptive, and emergent. And the lessons are that we can learn something from these processes. We can incorporate them. We've done so in the past and we still do so now, but we can do a lot better. If you remember, I showed this example before about how this gives rise to particular geometries. If we understand that, and if we embrace that, embrace some of those geometries, use that as a language of form, we might be able to bring more life into our environments, not copying and mimicking the exact structures of the past, but generating a lot of the qualities that are very desirable in those buildings, the beauty of those structures, the durability of those structures, and so on. And this is, again, I talked about these before, the different properties that he documented that exist in nature, and so on, this sort of fractal patterns, and so on. So the last thing I want to cover, we're almost out of time here, and I'm going to do this quickly so that we can wrap it up, is a kind of unifying view of urban space that I refer to as place networks. And I'll give you an example from a street where I used to live in London. So if you're thinking about, well, how do you structure urban space in a way that is healthy and conducive to well-being and people want to walk and so on? Well, part of it is the way the different regions of space are related to one another. As Alexander said, the centers being related to one another. And in fact, you can see different regions of that streetscape. This is kind of a montage of, turning the corner here on the left. There's places where you can stand and sort of be in a kind of urban room out in front of that store or in front of that store. You could be behind the glass there and see through it, or you can sit out on the little urban room seating area. You can be up in your private space, of course, various kinds. You can be in the private yard. You can hear but not see, but if you're in the glass, you can see but not hear. You can be up on the balcony and look down, you can't move. But if you're down on the street, you can move, and so on. So it's an incredibly complex network. Remember Latour's actor network theory. And you can, again, see or move or hear or see but not hear, or hear but not see but not move, and so on. Incredibly rich, incredibly complex network, and a network of intricate spaces too, down at the much finer scale that I haven't even shown. The aesthetic experiences, the biophilic experiences, the vegetation, and so on. It's all part of that network. So if you think about it, the most private spaces like our bedroom and so on, and the most public spaces out on the street, there's a tissue of spaces that connect those. And all of them have membranes, they have walls, right? And then they have the ability to go through those membranes. We have doors and windows. We can control those. We can open the door, we can draw the blinds, we can close the window, or we can even remodel them over time. We can change the environment. It's mutable. We can transform it. We are actors and agents that are distributed, that are transforming this place network over time. And in fact, I went back after 5 years and I can see how there were so many changes. You can see the obvious ones where the new businesses have opened and new signage, and new colors and so on, but also different treatments of the place network where they removed the seating, I guess at the time of year or something. They added a couple of places to demarcate the entry, a couple of potted plants. And then up above, they put balconies, railings to create terraces up there. They probably have, some kind of decking that they put down over the roofs and so on. So it's very interesting the way they gradually transformed that just over about, 7 years, I guess it was. And you can see the same thing in many, many cities, many great cities. This is Venice over about 100 years. The exact same cadastral plan on the left and on the right, but the right is the result of many, many transformations by different agents, transforming those place networks, manipulating, articulating, going to the Doge and getting permission to move this wall or add that little passageway or whatever, and creating this incredibly rich, incredibly complex, and incredibly beautiful place that we all know and love. There it is being transformed over, about 100 years or so. And you can see these transformations happening all over the world. This is a study by Mustafa bin Hamouche showing how these transformations can happen very informally through the adjacent property owners entering into agreements, like to create a new passageway because they want to open up their land for sale, or they want to open a little shop or something like that. Informal settlements have a lot of this genius in them. If we could tap into that and make them safer and more, healthier, we could do that. This is in Medellin, Colombia, where they did exactly that. They came in and did a few sort of strategic or catalytic projects. There's an escalator that they added and a couple of little public space projects, and new businesses opened around it, new activities, people upgraded their homes, and all kinds of really interesting catalytic results of that. Here is Pisa, Italy. You can see the sort of public space, the place network there that sort of naturally formed around the columns and around the seating area in the street and so on. Here's down the street from where I used to live in Portland, some old houses that have been converted to commercial. And again, you can see that very complex place network, very intricate spatial relationships. Some of the adaptations that have been made as a result of COVID. This is also in Portland, an area where they transformed the street and they created these little place networks, these seating areas, and then a bicycle pathway and other sort of articulations of the space. Really complex, intricate stuff. There's some examples of COVID adaptations where they create these little seating areas. I'm sure you have those, and you've seen those where maybe it's an underutilized parking area that they can take over and do these little seating projects and so on. Lots of examples of these place networks forming and reforming and articulating. But we have to be worried, I think, about what was happening, say, in 1910 in Italy, and 2010, this was as a result of the L'Aquila earthquake, where they built new buildings that the private space is right onto the public realm. There aren't any of these sort of tissue-like relationships other than the balconies, which are nice to have, I'm sure. And yet, here's Oslo in 1910, and you have this sort of sidewalk ballet, as Jane Jacobs referred to it, with people almost on top of one another, different activities going on, different regions, different businesses, different spaces that people are moving about and interacting in a really wonderful way, I think. And here's Oslo in 2010. This is a pretty sad example of what we're doing in far, far too many places around the globe today. This is not a place network in any meaningful sense. It's not even a pedestrian realm. I feel sorry for that poor guy walking there. I feel less sorry for the person in the car, because they're much more comfortable zooming past all of this. And that's what we're doing. We're forcing people into cars with this kind of environment. We need a more pedestrian scale, a more biophilic scale to get people out of their cars and get people into public spaces. We need place networks to support that activity, that sidewalk ballet. And we need to, as I said in the beginning, change the operating system for growth. All the laws and the regulations, the codes, standards, models, incentives, disincentives, all those things that produce what we have today. And I think public space is a remarkably cross-cutting topic that helps us to address many of these challenges and understand them in a more coherent way, and understand that our challenge is more like gardening, dealing with the ingredients and the tools that we would in a garden to promote healthy growth, healthy economic and urban growth, because that's the kind of problem a city is, a problem more like gardening than carpentry. If you think about gardening, what do? You find and build fertile soil, you plant good genetic seeds, you water and fertilize, you prune and weed, and you build supportive structures, supportive infrastructure, trellises, planter boxes, irrigation hoses, and so on. And just so, I think in the urban scale, we diagnose and improve, we get patterns and prototypes, incentives and funding, regulations, infrastructure and frameworks. And that's exactly what we need to do, I think, to implement our goals and to implement the new urban agenda, to achieve all that we need to do, combining those into, if you like, strategic toolkits that we can share and develop and move together on things like regulations, form-based codes, as I referred to, incentives and awards, micro grants and grants, public education, catalytic projects, other tools, governance tools like improvement districts, and so on and so on and so on. There are a dizzying number of these, and it's all important to develop these and make them available. And I think critically to support the crucial public space realm, because public space is the ultimate platform that that brings us together in cities. It's without, as Joan Close says, without public space, we really don't have cities at all. So thank you. We don't have much time for discussion, but thank you.